Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. Today I'm super excited to chat with our guest, Dr. Mike T. Nelson. Mike has a PhD in exercise physiology, a BA in natural science, and a master's in biomechanics. Mike, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on, man. So before we dig into our topic today on metabolic flexibility, can you give us a little bit of background on how you got into this health and fitness stuff to begin with?
Yeah, the short version is I got into lifting weights because even my first year of college, I was 6'3", I'd have been that height since like ninth grade. And I was basically an eel-shaped rake at about 156 pounds. So I always kind of thought I would like lifting, but like most guys, I got into it, to look a little bit bigger, stronger, that type of thing. I was very weak, got pinned by the bar in high school without any weight on it, and went to college, took a weight training class, and I'm like, hey, this will be great. I'll actually learn how to lift weights. I'm so excited. And one of the local coaches came in to teach it. And so the first day we take roll call and he kind of looks around and he goes, some of you people around here need to lose weight. And he looks and points at me and he goes, holy crap. And some of you need to gain a lot of weight. Sadly, he left after that, and we never saw him again. So we didn't learn a damn thing in the class. So I just kind of wandered around aimlessly and beat the crap out of myself for several years. And at the time, I always wanted to do physiology stuff, but I didn't know what to do with it. So when I did my undergrad, I then went to graduate school and did more of the mechanical engineering, biomechanics route. And then I actually ended up working for a medical device company for about 10 years after that. And then between that, a couple of years after I graduated, I started doing a PhD also in biomedical engineering. Did that for about 4 to 5 years, and I just did not want to do any more math. And I was spending all my free time going to exercise physiology conferences, literally for fun, just harassing people there. And I thought, well, maybe I'll go over and start doing exercise physiology. So I dropped out and I started training a few clients in person at this time and got my CSCS and that type of thing in, I think, 2005 or 2006. And when I went over to the physiology department, literally the first meeting we had, my advisor walks in. He's like, hey, we got 2 new projects. One's on heart rate variability and one's on metabolic flexibility. And they both involve a lot of math. And I'm like, uh-oh.
Perfect.
And so he's kind of looking around the table and he points at me. I'm sitting at the very end. He's like, hey, you, new math boy, whatever the hell your name is. These are your projects now. I'm like, oh, I don't know if I want more math. I came here to do physiology. That was the first time I heard of either one of those topics. And so my thesis was actually on basically the fine scale variability regulation in physiologic systems, which just bores the crap out of people. But it's using math to kind of look at, are there new ways we can look at physiology beyond just at rest and steady state? And then if we kind of poke the bear by doing exercise, can we look at it from a little bit different perspective? So for like heart rate variability, if we just take the average and we get a resting heart rate, well, that's kind of cool. That gives us some information. If we gather the data at rest and we do a variability analysis, so how much is this kind of little R wave or this heart contraction changing on the millisecond from one point to the next, that actually tells us the status of our autonomic nervous system. So taking some of those concepts into physiology and metabolism, and then looking, okay, are there ways we can maybe apply some of this stuff to metabolic cart testing and to metabolic flexibility? The end goal was to try to get a non-invasive way to determine metabolic flexibility.
Very cool, man. Actually, as just a little side note, I've noticed that a lot more engineers are getting into the nutrition industry and putting in kind of crunching numbers, putting algorithms in place, and they just have a sort of a knack for it.
Yeah, and what I realized too is that a lot of stuff in exercise physiology doesn't involve a lot of higher end math. And, I think it was Seth Godin was saying that kind of all the easy problems have been solved. We're kind of left with the really hard problems, or what's called kind of sort of wicked problems. And I think you're going to need more math and more higher level of thought to kind of figure those out also. But from exercise phys, most people don't take hardly any math. If we look in the past, like, heart rate variability is becoming a little more popular now, but, that was started in the late 60s, even before that a little bit. Oxygen kinetics was really big in the 80s for a while, but just completely fell out of favor because no one could explain it to anyone. Right. You had to have a pretty good background in math and engineering to even figure it out. So it's getting better, and I think it's becoming a little bit, quote unquote, more popular. I think that's just because the issues we're trying to solve are more difficult, which makes me want to bang my head against the wall when people start talking about thermodynamics and calories in and calories out. And most of the people who have very good intentions have never suffered through a thermodynamics class or heat transfer or any of that kind of stuff. So it makes me want to jump off a cliff sometimes.
Fair enough, man. So moving on to metabolic flexibility, what exactly is it, and can you kind of lay it out and define it for us?
Yeah, so the cool part about metabolic flexibility is I think it respects the kind of dynamic nature of physiology. So if we back up and we go, okay, so in the fitness field, everyone who wants to kind of take one position that, fats are the new fuel, they're like the best thing ever to fuel your body. No, like for high intense exercise, carbohydrates are the best. We had the whole high carb craze, back in the 80s and 90s. Now, as I'm sure we'll get into, ketones are real popular. Ketones are the best fuel your body needs to use. And if we stand back and we look at that, my answer is that all of those can be true based on metabolic flexibility. It just depends upon what you're trying to do and kind of what state your body is in. So metabolic flexibility is how well you can use different fuels in the body. So if we simplify it right now to carbohydrates and fat, so how well under a very kind of low intensity and steady state exercise, kind of low end, even just hanging out doing this podcast, how well can your body use fat? But then if we go out and do a 500-meter row or we do some type of intense exercise, how well can we use carbohydrates to fuel that type of exercise? And then the second part is how fast can you switch back and forth between those fuels? So if you're lifting and doing something very intense, maybe you're doing the Bill Starr 5x5 on deadlifts, during your rest period, you're actually going to shift back a little bit more and start using fat. The second you start doing that exercise again, you're going to shift up and using carbohydrates a little bit more. We don't see this a lot because a lot of the standard exercise physiology testing is done on an endurance model, and it's more of a continuous exercise model. But we're getting to the point now where I think we're trying to respect, okay, how fast can you use this fuel and how fast can you shift down to the other end? If we look at a disease spectrum like type 2 diabetes, we know that in general, everyone agrees that they have a hard time with carbohydrate metabolism on the one end. And the body goes, oh, that's okay, we'll figure this out. And it's a little bit overly simplistic. But if I just keep putting out more and more insulin, I can then kind of jam more carbohydrates in there and I can get over this issue, this pathology that we have. But as your baseline level of insulin goes up, it actually starts decreasing your body's ability to use fat as a fuel. So type 2 diabetics get actually very metabolically inflexible. They have a harder time on the one end using carbohydrates, and then they have a harder time actually even downshifting to start using fat. So even though that disease has been kind of classically called a carbohydrate impairment, I would argue, and there's good data to support this, that it's a metabolic flexibility issue. That over time, you're going to get basically so squished from both ends of the spectrum that your body is going to have a really hard time using either fuel. And that's going to bring a world of hurt and all sorts of other issues come with it.
That's a great breakdown, man. Now, how can folks find out if they are metabolically flexible? Are there some telltale signs that someone is either efficiently or inefficiently switching between the fuel sources?
Yeah, so one of the tricky parts is in the lab, there's not necessarily an agreed upon gold standard for that. Some of the early stuff would do what's called an insulin clamp study. So in short, they would infuse insulin in one arm, so you'd have an IV in one arm and a carbohydrate solution in the other arm. And they basically just whack both of them up as high as they possibly can. And so it's very much a supraphysiologic, so outside of the normal physiologic state. but it does give you some very cool information about, insulin and glucose dynamics. The hard part is it's not everyone's going to be able to run those types of studies. You got to know what you're doing. You probably have to be in the hospital. We can do other things by looking at the fuel that you're burning and comparing that to what we feed you. So if we give you just a crap ton of carbohydrates and we have you do what's called indirect calorimetry, so metabolic cart, those tubes you see when you go into the lab with the guy with the tube stuff in his mouth that goes in a little cart, each time you exhale, it'll give you a reading of how much fat and how much carbohydrate you're using, or something called the RER. And by doing that, if we feed you a specific thing, we can look at, does that match what you're acutely burning at that time? All right, so if you were to go out to 7-Eleven and have a large Slurpee with no ice, you have big, massive bolus of carbohydrates coming in, your body will then, in a healthy person, switch to start to burn more of those carbohydrates. The inverse is if you woke up in the morning, we just throw you on a metabolic cart, and you're a healthy person, you're probably burning more fat. So kind of looking at the dynamic nature of that. So if you don't have any fancy lab equipment, what are kind of rough proxies you can use? So what I use is I'll give someone a bunch of carbohydrates, and then you could look at maybe glucose levels, right? So you could do kind of an informal oral glucose tolerance test. So take about 80 grams of carbohydrate, that rest usually first thing in the morning, and then just measure your blood glucose about every 20 or 30 minutes for about 2 hours. Gives you kind of this little curve to see where you're at. Or if you want to do it experimentally, have some type of high carbohydrate meal, and then for the next 2 hours, just kind of report how you feel. In my opinion, if you don't feel very good, you may have something going on kind of the glucose end of the spectrum. It gets tricky because other things like sleep deprivation and other things can kind of mess with that acutely. On the flip side, if we look at, okay, what's a good marker for how well your body can use fat, periods of fasting are a pretty good proxy. So if you can easily go 12 to maybe 15 hours without eating, you're probably pretty good at using fat. Now, that hasn't really been demonstrated in the lab yet, but as you fast, you kind of downshift to use more fat, and you should probably feel okay. There's some anecdotal data from metabolic cart studies on athletes who are very, very much on the carbohydrate end of the spectrum. And then now we're actually seeing some athletes that are very much on the fat end of the spectrum. So they kind of lose that kind of switching ability. So I look at, high amount of glucose, see how you feel, the opposite kind of fasting and see how you feel. That gives you a pretty good rough approximation. So kind of what I like to see is if most people they're healthy, 80 grams of carbohydrates and they went to lift, boom, everything's fine, no issues, no kind of hypoglycemic type feeling or sensations. And then on the flip side, if they had to fast for, say, 15, I kind of like people eventually to get up to 19 to 24 hours. Yeah, I may feel a little bit hungry, but if I had to, I could still perform on that day. I could still do most things, and it's going to be okay. That gives you a pretty good proxy on both ends.
For that bolus of carbohydrate pre-workout, the 80 grams, are you talking about a mixed meal, or are you talking something fast-acting just beforehand, or does it matter?
Yeah, so what I like to do is I'll test kind of the worst case scenario. So initially I'll have people do maybe 40, and that would be their breakfast for that day. Because if they're going to have some weird reaction to it, I don't want them under a heavy load.
Right.
So I'll tell them I know you're going to freak out because there's no protein or whatever. It's just one meal out of the week. We'll use it as a test. Don't worry. And then just kind of document how they feel, for about up to 2 hours. If that feels good, I may jump them to 80. Yeah, depending upon the size of the athlete, that type of thing. If that goes really well, I may then have them keep a nutrition log and just log their meals and how they feel, and then go back and see if there's any patterns. So every time you have, let's say, a bunch of oatmeal and eggs in the morning, you feel kind of wonky for a couple hours, maybe I'll flip the carbohydrate amount to the carbohydrate source, or we can get super fancy and get like a continuous glucose monitor, this little tiny disc that would put on your tricep, and it'll take a reading every 5 minutes for like 2 weeks. And there you can do all sorts of different things and see, what is kind of the kinetics, what is the response of their system. And that's pretty cool to see. Only within probably the last year we've been able to do that. And again, that's on the extreme side. So initially I want to do carbohydrates in isolation. I may play around with the type, and then I may just have them incorporated with meals and see how they feel.
That's great, man. And I think a really practical way for folks to think about it, which you kind of explained, is like if you have a bolus of carbohydrate and then your blood sugar crashes when you're training, like you said, under a heavy load, probably not a great sign. And then if you skip a meal and you're getting hangry and you're not able to even go, say, to miss one meal and it sort of ruins your mental clarity, focus, energy levels, all that sort of stuff, probably not a sign that you're all that metabolically flexible either, eh?
Yeah, I agree with that. The interesting thing is that when I initially started doing this a couple of years ago myself, I thought that as my blood glucose would drop, I was curious about people who reported symptoms of hypoglycemia, like you feel real just trembly and twitchy and not good at all. And I wouldn't recommend that anyone do this, but I basically tried to see if I could recreate that scenario for myself. And the only time I could is if my stress was super high, very little sleep, and then about 100 grams of a fast-acting carbohydrate, I was able to do it. The funny part is when I took my measurement, my blood glucose wasn't that low. So I don't know if the actual number is as useful as the symptoms. There's some other data to show that for people who get just super tuned to carbohydrates, I think what happens is that gain of that whole system gets kind of rearranged, meaning that they're not able to tolerate these slight drops in glucose and they get very hypoglycemic. They get that very typical response, even though they're not kind of classically hypoglycemic, that the gain of the system gets messed with. So if they were, let's say, 100 and they drop to 90 or 85, they're just freaking out. So I think there's some sensitivity to the system that gets kind of changed around a little bit. So that's why I may have them do that, but I still want them to note how they felt. And if I can get background data like heart rate variability and sleep and other things like that, my next thought is, okay, can I have them do this again? But let's get their stress much lower. Let's make sure they had enough sleep. Let's get their HRV in a better range. And most of the time, people can then tolerate carbohydrates better. And there's a whole bunch of data looking at, one night of sleep will kind of mess up glucose and insulin relationships. I know you've had Dan Party on here before, who's awesome. So that's kind of the thought process, that I do like to have both. I want the number, and I kind of want their subjective report of it too.
That's really interesting, man. And I guess kind of what you were saying there is that stress, lack of sleep, things like that allow for less slack in the system. I guess you could put it that way. Yeah.
And this is an oversimplification, but in my brain, I'm like, okay, so what happens, right? If you get less sleep, we all agree that your stress is going to go up. And I've done HRV, just heart rate variability, a way of monitoring stress in people. And my online clients daily for going on like 6 years now. And there'll be some people who can eat horribly nutrition-wise, and wow, they perform pretty good. There's some people who can train, which I would say very idiotically, they perform well. But nobody so far has been able to get much less sleep and still perform and have their stress be where it should be, especially when we give them sleep back. So at a base level, again, oversimplification, but if we take away sleep, we know your stress level goes up. But when you're stressed, what fuel is your body going to want to use to try to buffer that stress? Probably carbohydrates, right? Because your body is very much wired to survive. It's your whole goal of your body, your physiology is to survive. And I think that we see that in sleep deprivation. We see people seek out more carbohydrates. They seek out more food. We look at cortisol, right? Cortisol levels go up. What's the opposite of cortisol? Insulin, right? So if we bump up insulin, maybe we're trying to buffer some of those cortisol levels. So my guess is that I think if we look at the overall stress on the body or on your organism, then it kind of makes sense in those lines that people will probably be driven more to use more carbohydrates. And we see the opposite case too. So I always think, okay, if this is true, then what's the opposite of that, and is that true? So if we pull out a massive amount of carbohydrates out of your diet, and we stress you with exercise or different things like that, is it much harder for you to handle those stressors? And again, anecdotally, that's what we see, right? Which gets into people doing ketogenic diets and other diets under high amounts of stress. To me, that's just a disaster waiting to happen. Again, it doesn't mean ketogenic diets are bad. It just means that you're kind of removing the one thing that was kind of buffering some of that stress capacity for you.
Absolutely, man. That's a great breakdown. Now, that leads me perfectly into the next question about, I've experienced and often also hear folks say when they're on a low carb or a ketogenic diet, they just don't have that higher gear during intense exercise. So what are your thoughts on low carb and keto diets with high intensity work? And then do you think that some folks can actually perform optimally, or is that just not possible from a physiological standpoint?
Yeah, so the first segment I'll make is, are they trying to be competitive or do they just enjoy doing it, right? So if they enjoy doing it and they're not concerned about that slight drop in performance, literature would say it's probably at least in the single digits. Who cares then? I'm not that concerned because they told me that performance wasn't their absolute metric. Now, if they're talking about energy and other things, it gets a little bit more complicated. But if they came to me and said, hey, I want to be as competitive as possible, then yes, we have literature showing that if you put someone on a ketogenic type diet, so very, very high fat, low to moderate protein, very low carbohydrates, probably less than 50, maybe less than 30 grams per day, which people, if they haven't calculated that, is very, very small. We do see that over time, changes in the metabolic machinery as it proceeds. So if you go back in time, like a lot of the 80s and 90s, they did a lot of very cool ketogenic studies. The main one was Dr. Stephen Phinney did one of the very first ones in 1983, I think. I was just at a conference presenting with him a couple weekends ago, so I got to talk to him about it, which is super cool. And in that study, they showed that, if I remember right, 2 cyclists did neutral, 2 got better, and I think 1 or 2 got worse. But when they tested them, this was on a ketogenic type diet, it was at moderate to maybe high threshold work. You know, if they put them and did really high threshold work, they didn't do quite as well. So fast forward into the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of studies looking at fat adaptation, hyperloading people on fat, because the thought process with endurance athletes is maybe this is a missing factor for performance. What we saw is that those studies for performance didn't really pan out. There wasn't really an increase in performance. So then the researchers went, so if we look at what fuel they're using during exercise, even like people running a marathon who are very competitive, right? So these are runners who are running very, very fast. They went, oh, they're primarily using more carbohydrates. So what if we do this? What if we take our kind of ketogenic type diet and then 1 or 2 days before the race, we just give them back just a piss ton of carbohydrates, right? And the thought process is pretty good. Right, we'll upregulate some aerobic-based stuff. We'll upregulate all the fat use, the enzymes, and everything associated with that. Jeff Bullock did the faster study a couple of years ago that showed that, yep, you take highly adapted ketogenic type athletes, they can use super high amounts of fat, and that's true. So they give them back a crap ton of carbohydrates. They go and do their race. Not much better. So then they're scratching their head going, well, wait a minute. So let's do a muscle biopsy before the race, and let's make sure that all the glycogen is actually there. Maybe we didn't give them enough carbohydrates, even though our calculations are correct. They do the muscle biopsy. They look, yep, they've got pretty good levels of muscle glycogen. The problem wasn't the substrate amount. It was the access to the substrate at the highest level. So what we see, Stellingworth has shown this and some other researchers, there's a downregulation in the PDH enzyme, so pyruvate dehydrogenase. And what that means is that if you take someone, put them on a ketogenic type diet, because they're not using this carbohydrate end of the spectrum very well, the body, use it or lose it, kind of slowly starts downgrading it a little bit. So even when you give them back a whole bunch of carbohydrates, they've lost some of that metabolic carbohydrate machinery. And again, that's probably in the single digits for performance. So is it a massive performance difference? No. But if you're competitive, a 2% difference is utterly massive to those people. So then the thought kind of drifted, from there, and they kind of fell out of favor up until like just even a couple of years ago now. So I think that it's more of an access issue, and exactly what you said, athletes will report that, I'm just missing that, that top end gear. Like I need to drop the hammer and like nothing is there. And I think the perception that I had several years ago, which was wrong, is that in very long duration endurance events, you think that, oh my God, this has got to be almost all fat. But you forget that. So I volunteered for the Race Across America. I was one of the crew people for that many years ago. So if people don't know, real briefly, it's we were on a team of 4. So 4 racers. Our team was not professionals, but very, very high level accomplished people. Somebody is pedaling their bike every hour, every second of the day for almost a week. You start in San Diego and you finish in Atlantic City, New Jersey. So someone is pedaling their bike all the way across that whole distance. And so in my head, I'm thinking, man, this has got to be, a lot of fat that's being used during this event, which is true. But then you realize that in the middle of Nebraska, we had one of our guys like just pass one of the other team members. So in the middle of the race, being sleep deprived, he basically has to drop the hammer and ride past this guy as fast as he can because there's no drafting. You're like, holy crap, that requires a lot of speed and power. You wouldn't think a 7-day endurance event requires speed and power, or going up hill climbs and things of that nature. So I think the role of carbohydrates, even in ultra-long endurance events, is maybe not as accurate as what most people think. So I think there is a role for carbohydrates. Last point on that, too, is that they took, this past year, some top-level endurance athletes who are marathon runners, and I can't remember what times they were at, but it was very, very fast. And they basically biochemically blocked their body's ability to use fat. And what they saw is their race times made no difference, meaning that if you completely, on the ultra-high-end performance, block fatty acid use, you don't impair performance at all. So if you get back to metabolic flexibility, the first question I ask someone is, okay, are you trying to be really competitive, or are you trying to do this for body comp reasons? And those are two different fields. So they tell me I want to be super competitive. Yeah, we may do some aerobic-based stuff, some fat use in their off-season, but when it's race time, most of that is going to be using carbohydrates. Now, if their body comp goal and they just want to finish a marathon, that's different. I'm probably going to really push them to use a little bit more fat and that type of thing. So I think there's a role for both. It just depends upon what you're trying to accomplish.
Totally. So I think that sometimes people think, okay, carbohydrates, sprinting, fat at rest, right? So yeah, it's more of like a sliding scale, right? It's not like we're using 100% carbohydrate or 100% fat for fuel at any given time.
Yeah, and I tell people it's a slider switch, right? So I used to DJ for years. I actually DJed at a metal radio station in college. And so you would kind of fade one disc into the other disc, right? So on the left end, you've got this disc, and the right end, you've got this disc. Shows how old I am because they didn't have MP3s and stuff back then. And you get this kind of mix back and forth. And that's where most people are, right? There's very few events that are 100% carbohydrate, and there's very few events that are 100% fat. But there's definitely events that are more on one end or the other. And in the middle is what's called the crossover point. So the crossover point is where you're using 50% fat and 50% carbohydrates. And that point is pretty plastic, meaning we can move it around a fair amount. And I think that you can do a metabolic test and look at someone and see kind of where they're missing. So if an athlete comes to me and let's say they're pretty high performance, and I look and they don't even have a crossover point, meaning they're very horrible at using fat, while it may not benefit them from a performance standpoint, as long as we can keep enough carbohydrates running through them and they don't have GI issues and other things going on, I do wonder about their metabolic health. They can't downshift to use fat very well. And if you look in the literature, we see this from Godecki did one study, Helge, I did one study, and we just take people off the street and we kind of put them in the lab, recreationally active people, and we hook them up to a metabolic cart. So at rest or very low intensity, how well they can use fat varies from like 20 to 93%, meaning that for the same amount of workload, some people are really, really good at burning fat, and some people are utterly horrible at doing it. So on that low end, that fatty acid use or oxidation, there's massive variability from one person to the next. So even an athlete who is really, really using carbohydrates, from a metabolic health standpoint, I do want them to kind of get down towards that end or have a little bit better crossover point. I think you can do that without impairing their performance. My gut feeling is that they'll be more metabolically healthy. Some other people, then you can increase that low end, but you don't want to lose the top end. So what a lot of people did, which I don't believe is correct, is they'll say, okay, you need more fatty acid use. We're going to put you on a ketogenic type diet. We're going to just really pull your carbohydrates back. You're not going to be able to train very intense. We're going to do more low to moderate, old school base building. Cool. To me, that sounds awesome. The caveat is you better make sure that you have enough time allocated to bring them back to the other end to regain that slight single-digit performance amount that you lost. And another cool point on that, too, is that what I'll do personally is if I have someone who I'm trying to increase the use of fatty acid, but their primary sport is carbohydrate. So maybe they're a CrossFit athlete, maybe they're a strongman, maybe they're a sprinter, things of that nature. But I want a super high aerobic base that's using fat because I think that'll allow them to train more day in and day out, makes them more metabolically flexible. I think it helps their metabolic health. But I can't impair their carbohydrate use. I'll then slowly work them up to 1 day of fasting per week. A lot of times these athletes are body comp athletes too. So relative strength is super high important to them. They want the highest performance they can get at the best body composition. So I can take 1 day, let's say, and Monday, an off day, have them fast for maybe 19 hours. We take out a whole bunch of calories. We push insulin super low. We drive the body to use more fat. Maybe they do an easy, moderate intensity recovery ride or something that day. And then what's cool is the next day, I can give them 300 grams of, say, carbohydrates, and there's no issue with PDH enzyme regulation because fasting does not appear to mess with that process. That's probably because at the end of those 24 hours, liver glycogen is very low, but muscle glycogen, unless they did a lot of work, is almost untapped. So I think by holding that muscle glycogen there, you don't lose as much of that metabolic machinery. And the time course is super short, right? You're only talking about 1 day. You're not talking about weeks. So if I have someone who wants both ends of the spectrum, they can't afford to take a really long off season to work on something, and body composition is also important. I found that that's been like super, super useful.
That's great, man. Now, how does insulin sensitivity play in here, which you touched on? Because we'd assume that someone who is insulin sensitive is most likely metabolically flexible and then vice versa, right?
In general, I would say yes. In all honesty, I've been going back and kind of rethinking glucose and insulin and glucagon and GLP-1 and all that kind of stuff, which I firmly blame Dr. Brian Walsh for that. So, but he's awesome. And so insulin sensitivity is a weird thing. For the longest time, and I generally agree that better insulin sensitivity is a good thing. The caveat is, which tissue are we talking about? So the argument from a body comp, old school bodybuilder thing was make muscle very insulin sensitive and make fat very insulin insensitive, right? We want to preferentially shove nutrients to muscle. We don't want to store them in fat. And a couple of years ago, I wrote an article on this that I finally found a mouse model where they did a knockout model and they did exactly that. And in my head, I'm thinking, wow, this is going to be great. This is going to be like the holy grail for body composition. This is going to be amazing. And what they saw was the mice had all sorts of health issues. What happened was they were not able to take fat and to bring it into the fat cell. They knocked out all the transporters. So what happened? The fat backed up in the liver and backed up in the blood. Their triglyceride levels went sky high. So I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that's not good. if you look back in some of the literature, especially from the Gatorade Sports Institute from the late 80s, early 90s, one of the other questions related to this I had was, well, for fat loss, what's limiting, lipolysis or fatty acid oxidation? Right, so lipolysis, how much fat can we break down into the individual, basically, molecules that we can then use for fuel and burn? Is it the breaking down process and getting them into the bloodstream? Or is it the sheer act of just using them as a fuel, like kind of tossing them into the furnace? Right? If you were to take a wood-burning stove, what's the limit to heat your house? Is it how many logs you need to split, or is it how many logs you need to throw in the fireplace? And it's actually the latter. So fatty acid oxidation appears to be the rate limiting step. So the more you can do of that, the better you'll increase your body's ability to use fat. So back to the mouse knockout model, I think having optionality, having the ability to get stuff out of the bloodstream and put it into different tissues is probably a benefit, because that would be a survival advantage. What you want to do then is kind of limit the downside negatives of that. So I think by allowing more fat to kind of go in the fat cell, have it be pulled out via lipolysis and then burned is going to be much better than trying to figure out where you're going to divert it to. If we go back to looking at muscle and insulin sensitivity, if you look at a ketogenic type diet, you'll find that the muscle becomes very glucose, almost insensitive, what's called a non-pathological insulin resistance. And what that is I believe, a mechanism to shove more glucose up to the brain, right? So if your body is survival-based, you got to keep the brain, you got to keep the lights on there, number one. So muscle's kind of an optional thing. It's definitely good to have, but the brain's got to be number one. So if we make the muscle more insensitive to glucose, we're bypassing that and shifting more to the brain. That doesn't appear to have any pathologies associated with it, but from a standpoint of metabolic flexibility, it makes me a little bit more concerned. And again, that's a temporary state. So I think making the muscle as sensitive as possible is good. If you go one step down, you can then look at the different transporters, like GLUT4, GLUT2, and different receptors. A lot of those are mediated by insulin. So if we whack up insulin levels, they come out and they bond to the outer part of the membrane and they can pull glucose in. There's also non-insulin mediated uptake, where working muscle can literally just suck glucose right out of the bloodstream. So which is probably why exercise and just movement in general is so important, right? You're giving the body a sink to kind of get that out of the bloodstream and to actually use it as a fuel. So all that to say, I think insulin sensitivity is a good thing. Probably depends on what organ system we're looking at. And it also depends on where your baseline state is at. If you're doing a ketogenic type diet, you may have changes in that muscle that I think is trying to increase your body's ability to survive by shuttling more glucose to your brain. You can then go down a path, which again, I stole this from Dr. Brian Walsh, of looking at the thing that's always bugged me for years then is like glucose disposal agents. So I'm like, the data on them is not that impressive. But if we assume that it works, we're trying to force more glucose into a muscle that already said, I don't want it. I think that's a bad idea. So even if they do work, debatable, I think the body is trying to protect that machinery inside and saying, no more glucose. We can't handle it. All these bad reactions are taking place. We're burning the house down inside. It's like if you've got a party that's overrun your house, you're going to lock the doors and not let any more nutbags in your house, right?
Right.
Opening the door and throwing more people in there is just going to make it worse. So I think in fitness, we have to be a little bit careful about taking the kind of overly simplistic view that if we look at the body as kind of wired for survival, my thought is that if you're more metabolically flexible using fats and carbohydrates and ketones and lactate and everything else, that's going to definitely increase your survival ability. It'll probably translate into performance, but not all the time. I think for health, that's going to be a little bit better. So kind of a very roundabout answer to your question.
No, very cool, man. And using your analogy about, having a party in the house, if we're using glucose disposal agents to sensitize the muscle to insulin even more, but it's full. Like if the house can't take any more people, then it's essentially irrelevant anyways. And then that glucose is going to have to go somewhere else. And you could almost see that inevitably causing problems, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And you go further down that path, it's probably more glucagon that may be the more issue. Maybe other agents like GLP-1, things of that nature. And you look at insulin response is biphasic. So the first pass of insulin, or the first response, what's called the cephalic phase, is all entirely nervous system driven. And then you've got this more longer second phase of insulin release. And I think we'll come to find, and there's some pretty good evidence on this now, that first phase insulin gets messed up. You're probably going to start running into problems, even though you may not necessarily feel that way, or you may not see anything show up. So if I see someone take in a huge amount of carbohydrates, and let's say they're on a continuous glucose monitor, and I see them spike up to 200 and then just slam back down, ooh, something's not right there, right? Your first pass of insulin, something's really goofy. Again, I got this from Brian too, is that if you look at a marker on blood work, you can look at something called glycomark. So glycomark is another glycolylated protein, but it's got a different half-life than the HbA1c. So HbA1c is kind of your 3-month average. We can grab a fasting glucose right away. If your glycomark is goofy, that's telling you that you probably see these super high excursions of blood glucose, and then they're rapidly coming back down. So it's not enough to show up in your average, and you may not catch it in a fasting reading. And that's usually the first hallmark that something's going awry. And I think we'll find more and more data showing that once that's messed up, you're not going in the right direction. The good part is it's probably early enough we can kind of move the car around and go a different direction and probably change it. But I think looking for those types of things is going to be very, very useful, and hopefully will become more popular in the future.
That's fascinating, man. So the glycomark is taking into account more of the highs and the lows, but then the hemoglobin A1C averaging over the last 2 to 3 months is just taking averages.
Yeah, so I think a glycomark is a very, very short snapshot in time that protein gets altered. And it has to do with the way the protein is excreted from the body or not. And that the nice part is it's been around for quite a while. It's got pretty good data on it. So, for example, I use my wife as an example. So we had some blood work done on her, which I did through Dr. Ben House, Functional Med Costa Rica, awesome dude. And her baseline glucose was good, was 87. HbA1c was good, was 4.8%. So by all people, they'd say that's great. Her glycomark was completely wonky. So neither one of those, the fasting or the 3-month average, will pick up those short snapshots in time. So we then had her do a continuous glucose monitor. We just got the data back, so I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. But my bet is that if we look immediately after a higher carbohydrate meal, we're probably going to see blood glucose go up pretty high and then come back down. So continuous glucose monitor is a way to kind of figure out which one of those things, maybe it's the carb amount. We've seen different types. Like we did this when I was at Ben's retreat in Costa Rica last year. Like some people, like pineapple, would just skyrocket their blood glucose. Oatmeal, white rice, not much difference. Even though we would say, whoa, dude, those are the same amount of carbohydrates, there should be absolutely no difference between that. I don't think glycemic index and glycemic load are all that useful. I think that individually completely washes out those as metrics. So in my data, when I had it done, I'm like, I'm going to test the piss out of this thing, right? So I'm going to have the thing put on, and I would do like 2 Pop-Tarts and a cookie for breakfast, just to see what would happen. And I played around with all sorts of different stuff. And luckily in my case, it barely ever got above 120. I mean, I could take in a crap ton of carbohydrates acutely, not much of effect. But, there could be maybe some genetics. My sleep was also very good. My stress was good. I usually walk, 8,000, 10,000 steps a day, was training 4 days a week, 5 days a week. So, pretty active, healthy person. So I think in the future, getting that kind of individual personalized data is going to be very powerful. And a lot of times that's the only way people will change their habits, right? Because I don't want people to go necessarily super restrictive, right? So kind of the current trend is that, oh man, these high carb foods are definitely going to be bad. Depends. If you can handle it and your blood glucose is not deviating that far, I don't think we have any good data to show that that's quote unquote bad. However, if you overreact to pineapple or something like that, or short the amount, change it, maybe you need more activity, maybe your stress is too high, maybe your sleep is off, maybe your blood work's kind of wonky in other directions. It gives us the ability to figure out what that thing is, that insult, and to work around it, and then very easily retest again in the future. So it does allow you to become very, I think, personalized, but on very solid physiologic mechanisms at a price point that's becoming cheaper and cheaper.
That's fascinating stuff, man. I remember hearing about a study that came out of Israel, and they were looking at blood glucose in response to different foods. Some people would have a high or low response in regards to a banana. Some people would be high or low in response to a cookie. The one in cell
metabolism, I think.
Yeah. So that was fascinating. And then one thing that Rob Wolf brought to my attention was the potential impact of a food sensitivity or an allergen or something impacting blood glucose via cortisol and insulin and all that sort of stuff. So then it becomes way more personalized too. But this stuff is just so cool.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and we're actually at a point now where the technology is becoming not a limiting step. So, I mean, in theory, and I've done this on a couple of people, I can get a HRV in the morning. I can get that every single day, right? So we could argue about a 4-point cortisol test, how useful that is. I'm not sold that it's that useful. Even if it is, even if it's super accurate, even if we get it on the cheaper end of the price point, that's still only one day, right? Totally. And if your circadian rhythm's all wonky and messed up, yeah, maybe enough to get someone to change their habits. But I'd rather have a non-invasive measure that we know is accurate if done correctly, and have that every single day. I can then pull, so I'll do this on clients, I'll pull their Fitbit data or Garmin data. Just give me your login. It'll record what time they went to bed, what time they get up. If you've got like an Oura ring, it'll do pretty accurate sleep analysis. We can get enough data almost kind of wirelessly. Maybe we throw a continuous glucose monitor on you because your glycomark is wonky. We can do all those things still within the parameter of health. Getting a continuous glucose monitor right now still requires, physician license and that type of thing. But it's giving people the power and the knowledge to kind of make those changes themselves well before they're ever, seeing super high levels for type 2 diabetes and things that are out of range. And what I've seen over time is if you provide them the correct data, many people are pretty motivated to change them. If you just kind of discuss and go, you should eat less cookies, good luck with that approach. It doesn't usually work quite so well. But if you can say, hey, look at this carb response and look at this response, let's have you focus more over on this food and less of this food for a while and see what happens. That's much more actionable, and it's also very specific to them. And I think that makes it easier for them to digest and to kind of rationalize their way through that process.
Amazing, man. Now, if we shift gears a little bit and look at a typical client that you work with, how does that sort of avatar client look? Are they male, female? How old are they? How much are they training and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so most of the clients I work with now are actually trainers themselves, probably 70, probably almost 80%. I generally only work with people online. I mean, I converted my garage to a gym at home. So I do work with some one-off people that come in for that type of work. Most of them are more on the competitive end of athletics. So they're doing something, whether they're just competitive themselves or strongman or CrossFit or things of that nature, usually more on the strength and power side. Most of them also have something that I call kind of the weirdness to them, whether it's, they did some physique competitions and kind of messed up their metabolism, or they've got a bunch of old injuries they can't figure out, or they're like super type A, super stressed out. It's usually something in there that they don't typically respond like everybody else. So they can't really take a program off an online site, even if it's well designed, and just kind of execute it. There's something that always tends to mess them up there. That's why I found using heart rate variability. We'll run like a blood spot test to look at fish oil, EPA, DHA content. And then I'll try to get as many metrics as I can in a non-invasive way. like I said, if they have a Garmin or Fitbit, we'll collect maybe some sleep data, or if we'll grab it off their Oura Ring, and then we'll kind of work them through the process that way. And yeah, I found that works pretty good. The caveat is, sometimes if they're not very experienced, then I'll just refer them to a local trainer. It's like, if you're not really sure how to squat, you go find a good local trainer, learn how to do some basic movements. And then once you get those down, you're looking for just tips and refinement. Then I think the online thing can work much better. The last caveat I have on that is that everything I try to do is based on their physiologic response. So on some people, they may get a continuous glucose monitor. And some people, I'll refer them out, go get a basic blood panel. We can use a separate tool to kind of look to see what's going on with that. But I want to know, what are they responding to? So if we give them a set training and their HRV drops all the time from it, okay, now I know something's going on. And what you find is that the variability from one person to the next is much higher than I ever would have guessed. I worked with a guy who qualified for Raw Nationals. Awesome dude, pretty high level stress, had gotten married, got a few kids from being married, and a bunch of other stuff going on. And he could do some pretty low volume, high intensity, singles, doubles, triples, 4 or 5 days a week, and he was okay. Other people, even with more sleep, man, that type of thing, 3 days of that just destroyed them. But a natural physique competitor I worked with, he could do 30,000 pounds of volume 4 to 5 days a week, and he could run that for 6 to 7 weeks and be pretty good, as long as we kind of played around with his movements. So you'll just notice kind of a big difference between one group and the next. And to me, what I found most helpful is having that physiologic response. What was their performance? What was their HRV? How was your sleep? How was your nutrition? And making sure those are all kind of lining up.
When you're seeing those massive swings, obviously everybody's so different, but are you working with natural athletes as well as enhanced athletes?
Right now, I only work with natural athletes. I worked with a couple enhanced people in the past, but I don't now. I don't personally care whatever people decide to do. Whatever you're going to do, you're going to do. That's your decision, not mine. But for me, it's like, I don't understand that stuff well enough to know what the hell's going on. The stories I hear from people is just crazy what some people will do. And totally. For me personally, it's like, I don't want any of the liability. I don't want any of the responsibility. And from a scientific standpoint, it makes it harder for me to figure out what the hell's going on. So I've just kind of opted, not to kind of work with that. Again, nothing against those people. People are going to do what they're going to do. It's just, in general, it's just too complicated for me to work on that. And I don't feel like I know enough in that area to even provide any sort of guidance, legality aside.
I hear you, man. Now, as we start to wrap up here, I'd love to just touch on the difference between optimal body composition and then optimal performance, because I think a lot of folks assume that they're one and the same, or they're the same spot, but they can be so different. And we touched on this a little bit before, but can you tell us more about how those are just different sliding scales, and for the vast majority of folks, it's not going to be the same optimal performance versus looking, quote unquote, their best?
Yeah, so I don't like the word optimal, even though I know what everybody means by it and everyone uses it all the time. So I'm not ripping on you for that, but it's that it can't be tested, right? So if you came to my lab, and when I was working at the University of Minnesota, I'm not there right now, but said, hey, I'll give you $2 million. I want to find the optimal body composition for CrossFit athletes. Good question, very valid question, very relevant. I don't know. I can tell you right now, I couldn't tell you what optimal is. I could, however, tell you, is protocol A better than protocol B in a set number of athletes? Boom, we could tell you that. So I think, what is a better way to get optimal or better body composition and better performance? Obviously, is a little bit better question. But that aside, where I see this a lot is in athletes who are in a relative weight class, or even like CrossFit. So CrossFit has a lot of things where gymnastics and moves, where having a super high relative strength is going to be to your benefit massively. Even strongmen, right? So strongmen now have all sorts of weight classes, even very lower weight classes than what they had 5-10 years ago. Again, not so much like World's Strongest Man, but your average local competition. So what I like to do with people is to figure out where is the sweet spot where your body composition is good and your performance is even better. Because the flawed assumption that I think most people come in with is, if I just got my body composition better, my performance is going to be better. And in some athletes I've seen, absolutely, that's 100% true. In other athletes I've seen, man, once you get below a certain point, which is, again, variable on everyone, if you're a male and you're already like 9%, like a legit 9%, if I drive you down to 6%, am I really going to make you that much better? In my experience, probably not. There's probably some rare exceptions to that. Now, if you want to be 7% just because that's what you like, cool, that's awesome. We can do that. So I like to take the off season and then get them to kind of where they think their optimal body composition or better body composition is, and then just religiously measure their performance. And then show them, okay, right as you get to, say, 9%, man, your performance is still good. We got you all the way down to 6%, which is ungodly lean. Ooh, boy, you started really tanking then, right? And then they go, oh, wow, okay. Oh, so I only have to be 9%. Oh, wow, that's not as bad as I thought, right? And I like doing that in the off season because I don't want them to do that anywhere close to competition. So I then want them to be at that body composition as they then do their prep. So if, let's say, they're a CrossFit athlete, they're getting ready to do the games, the qualifiers, all that kind of stuff, to me, they should be at their ideal body composition 3, 4, 5 months out from that, depending on how fast they can lose. And again, you're playing a little bit of a game in the next off season of, can we get your calories higher? Can we get your training volume higher? Can we maybe bump up that body composition to be a little bit worse? But we've got enough time to come down to where we need to be. And then, 3 months out, you're doing pretty good. What unfortunately I see a lot of athletes do is, okay, competition's coming up. We'll just pick an arbitrary date of March 1st is the first time I got to go perform. I haven't done this a lot. I'm trying to get leaner all the way up until March 1st. What you see is their performance is just going down. They don't really know where that floor is, and they're trying to accommodate more stress, more training volume, and everything else, and then they're trying to do it on reduced micronutrition and reduced calories. And a lot of times their injury risk goes up quite a bit too. And you add in humidity, hydration, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's playing around with them enough to know, where they should be and where is kind of the best for them. I don't work with as many endurance athletes, but the same thing, right? So endurance athletes psychologically tend to be worse, right? They're like, oh man, the top racers in my field, they're at a body weight of 166. I'm such a fat ass at 173. Really? That many? 7 pounds? I'm more interested in what is your performance at that weight, because if you're faster than everybody else and you can sustain that, I don't care if you're 200 pounds. I don't care if you look like the next person or not. The next question after that then, though, is if you were 200 and you're doing really well, maybe you could do a little better at 190. I don't know. But I think if their goal is performance, that's the metric that they're going to be graded on. That's the first thing that I'm going to do with them, make sure we get that good. And that may involve playing around with body composition a little bit, but I've noticed that it's not as much of an impact for people who are already pretty lean than what you would think. If you want to be a high-level games competitor and you're 30% body fat, yeah, we're probably going to work on that and definitely get you down. But if you're pretty lean already, man, I've just seen so many people performance just tank, trying to get ultra lean. And we see this with physique athletes, right? So a physique athlete, you're graded on your performance on stage on that particular day. No one gives a rat's ass how much you could squat or deadlift on that day. And you ask anyone who's done it, their worst performance metrics are probably on that day. But that's not what they're graded on, right? So we know at some point, if you really push that super, super hard, yeah, your performance is definitely going to start to go down. And for some people, there's some freaks that walk around super lean, good performance all the time. Other people just can't seem to pull that off either. So
I like that distinction of your definition of optimal and then also playing around with that stuff in the off season. That only makes sense because you want to be, if anything, maybe eat up into a competition as opposed to be cutting into a competition. So that's awesome. Yeah.
And even like in the physique world now, you'll see if someone has enough time to do it, they will be ready, 2 weeks or 2 months out, and then they'll kind of sort of reverse diet back into a show, right? So it's easier to be repleted on carbohydrates and everything else. And if you're already at the body comp that you needed to be at, I think that's probably going to be in your favor, and it's going to work a little bit better. Again, is that a realistic scenario for most people? Probably not, because nothing goes the way that it's planned, and rarely do you ever have, oh, I'm ready 4 weeks early.
Right.
It's just something will always seem to happen where, things happen just before the deadline, and that's just kind of the way it goes. But I like to do that with people just to give them an idea, and then also, and I don't work with a ton of physique athletes at all, but have another show or another competition. Some things that may not be until the following year. So if you're trying to qualify for CrossFit, that's kind of a once a year type thing. You got to go through the steps. But if it's a physique show or maybe a local strongman competition or something like that, maybe we can have another one in the back of our head that's kind of 4 months after that. Because me personally, I'm not going to just drive you into the ground just to make an arbitrary date, especially at a local level. If it's a big deal and you're trying out for the NFL and you've got a combine or something to do that's only happening like once a year, potentially once in your lifetime, or I worked with an athlete who was trying to qualify to be one of the bobsled pushers for the past Olympic Games. Yeah, those types of things, you've kind of only got one particular time, so you better start as early as you possibly can. But other than that, a lot of times there's another thing you could do, and so you don't have to be so extreme to make kind of a semi-arbitrary date.
Totally, man. Amazing insights, Mike. So if folks want to learn more about you, your services, courses, social handles, all that good stuff, man, where can they find you?
Yeah, so the best place is probably just my website, which is just MikeTNelson.com. So MikeTNelson.com. You can just search my name, Mike T. Nelson. I think it'll pop up on Facebook somewhere in there. I think I'm on Twitter the same. And then, so I do some online training with people. And then I have a certification that's just flexdiet.com. So FLEXDIET.com. And that kind of goes through 8 different interventions and how to use those for kind of what we talked about here based on metabolic flexibility and flexible dieting. Gives everyone a framework for coaches that they can then run their clients through. And it's usually geared towards matching exercise and nutrition, and it's a little bit more on the nutrition side, and then giving them the framework in order to do that in a easy to manage type setup.
That sounds great, man. I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes, and thanks again so much for taking the time. This is awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I feel honored to be here with all the other awesome guests that you've had too. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Awesome, guys. I'll catch you on the next episode.